So I just want to start off by introducing our moderator for today, Brittany Andrew-Amofah. Brittany is a public policy professional based in Toronto. She is currently the Senior Policy and Research Analyst at the Broadbent Institute, where she is responsible for assisting with setting the research and policy direction of the organization. Her work is grounded in providing a justice and anti-racism analysis to research and policy, which is informed by her personal lived community and political experience. Brittany is regularly sought out to provide research, analysis, and commentary on pressing policy and political issues in Canada. Thank you for moderating our discussion today, Brittany. Over to you.
Hello, hello. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you all for being here today. This is a really special event and a special time of year where, you know, the work of FoodShare is on display, but also a time where we get to reflect on the sort of work that we do, the issues that we're grappling with, and how we're all working towards our collective will to create change in this world. I do want to start off by saying that the topic of food insecurity, I think, is something that has really come into more progressive political conversations over the last few years. For myself, I was introduced into this particular topic, and I would say policy discussion, about 3 years ago. 3 years ago, when I made a concerted effort to understand the food landscape a little bit better, and also to join my local community garden. And that was where I was introduced to a whole new sort of conversation around injustices, around access to food, around food insecurity, but in a different way. Food insecurity from the lens of food justice and community work. And that is the reason why I'm really happy to be hosting and moderating this conversation today, because FoodShare really falls on that intersection of providing support services to individuals who need it the most, but also addressing the deep-seated issues and core issues of what is driving food insecurity in the first place, and how we can all collectively work towards addressing this injustice. So this is a thank you to FoodShare and the work that they do, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation tonight, or today. So I am going to introduce our panelists who have a wide range of experience that will be contributing to the conversation today. And my hope is that each of these panelists can share their work, the work that they do, what has led them into this work, but also how their specific expertise has been used during this time to really help and assist so many who are going through hardships throughout this pandemic, so many people who are experiencing food insecurity on a scale that we possibly haven't seen in quite some time, but also how we're working to support each other and working to support each other during this moment, and how we're all centering that right now in our work. So our first panelist that we have today is Moorthi Senaratne. Moorthi is FoodShare's Social Enterprise Operations Senior Manager. He and his team in the warehouse, and on deliveries have defined essential work during this pandemic. Moorthi was responsible for getting over 80,000 emergency good food boxes onto trucks, into bikes, and to the doors of households facing food insecurity in 2020. When you ask Moorthi how he did it, he will smile and say, "It was fun." Our next panelist today is Latisha Sartevra. Latisha has a background in science, engineering, and sustainability management. She joined FoodShare back in September 2017, and today is the Senior Director overseeing FoodShare's social enterprises, human resources department, and other operational functions. Since the pandemic began, Latisha has led the coordination of FoodShare's Emergency Good Food Box program with close to 100 Toronto-based community groups. Thank you for joining us, Latisha. And Ellie Adeker. Ellie is an activist, author, and educator who co-founded the People's Pantry Toronto and works with Maggie's Toronto Sex Workers Action Project. In 2020, she organized a mutual aid effort that raised more than $400,000 in COVID relief for 30,000 plus people across Toronto and the GTA by expanding access to free meals, grocery care packages, and emergency survival funds for sex workers left out of Ontario's pandemic relief strategy. So thank you all to my panelists today for joining us. I'm just going to go over some logistics for the conversation today. You can contribute to questions for the panelists using the Q&A function that is at the bottom of your screen. You can also vote up or down questions that people post in that chat box from others. And we really encourage you to keep the questions coming throughout the conversation. We want this to be an interactive session, and we really want to ensure that as much as we have the panelists here today, we also do want to hear from you. And also, Mo, who is kind of overseeing the event today, will be sharing the details in the chat of how you can contribute and also any other information that you may need to know as we move forward with our discussion today. So thanks a lot for your help today, Mo.
Yeah, no problem. I actually started working at FoodShare during the pandemic and recently started volunteering with the People's Pantry. So I'm really excited to learn more about the work being done on the front lines. I also want to let everyone participating know that you are all eligible to enter to win a Lunch and Strategize session with chef, author, and activist Joshua Maharaj. And I will put the entry form in the chat. That's open until this afternoon.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, so to start off the conversation, I want to go to each panelist, and I'm gonna start off with Ellie first. If you can kind of share what is one big thought or moment or even incident that has kind of stuck with you over this last year as it relates to food insecurity and as it relates to the pandemic. What is one big moment, thought that you would like to share with us that has informed your work and or outlook?
Got it. First of all, hi everyone, and thank you to FoodShare for putting all this together. I'm really excited to be in conversation with everyone today. It's so hard to think about one moment, and I think that for a lot of us, especially at the People's Pantry, we've been doing a lot of reflecting because we're coming up on our 1-year anniversary in mid-March. And I think that maybe like my biggest takeaway from a lot of what's happened is really like a culmination of moments, right? Starting back when we started to see some of the lockdowns and overcrowding in grocery stores and the hoarding of food items and like the very deliberate leaving behind of so many people in our communities. And coming from an organization like Maggie's, you know, we're one of Canada's oldest by and for sex worker justice organizations. We're also located in the heart of Toronto's downtown East End, which is really like the epicenter of like the housing and shelter crisis, right? The overdose epidemic that we're seeing. A lot of our shelters are like centrally sort of located there, and a lot of encampments have sort of popped up in that area. And so I think that, you know, my biggest takeaway from how the pandemic has evolved from the complete failure of our local government and the province and the Canadian government and showing up for poor and working class people and showing up for sex workers who've been completely left behind in a lot of emergency response. My biggest takeaway is how communities have come together. Like my background is in mutual aid work. And so it's very deliberately intervening with crisis supports, whether that's financial support, emergency food boxes, free meals, grocery care packages, in the absence of government support for our communities. And I think that one of the most difficult things, you know, going back a year ago to mid-March, I don't think anyone really understood how the pandemic was going to be so much exacerbated by issues of poverty and housing and our shelter crisis. And so it right away being unable to access like food items or like PPE supplies for poor and working class people, having a lot of like buildings and community centers shut down in the downtown core often meant that a lot of our communities were just left to go without things like food and shelter. And the only interventions that so many of our communities had, they didn't come from the city of Toronto, they didn't come from the province, they came directly from like organizations, but also largely like mutual aid groups, people showing up for one another. And, you know, I look at the evolution of a group like the People's Pantry, you know, we started as like 5 or 6 people just sort of like cooking out of our kitchens and like trying to go and deliver like groceries on our bikes. And I think now it's like, it's expanded so much, there's more than 500 volunteers. And that's a really beautiful thing. And one take home from the pandemic is like, it's really beautiful how much organizing our communities have been able to do, the kind of connections between organizations like FoodShare and Maggie's. It's been life-saving for a lot of sex workers. But I think I'm also left, you know, as we come up to the 1-year mark on lockdown in the city, I think I'm also left with a lot of anger and a lot of frustration, because it's beautiful we've been able to organize this way, but it never needed to be like this. Mm-hmm. You know, if we, like in the downtown east right now, the encampments popping up, the city taking legal action against one of the only people providing like secure shelter for people. You know, it's not just an issue of neglect and people left behind, like people are literally being left to die on the streets right now. And I think that so much of the work we do at Maggie's and People's Pantry sort of recognizes that food security is so wrapped up in issues of poverty and shelter and housing that you can't just address some of these things without meeting people's basic needs for things like food and grocery care packages. So, you know, I feel incredibly like moved to be doing this work and to be working with so many incredible people. But I think I'm also left with this feeling of like, it never needed to be like this. And there's no reason that we've had to lose so many people in our communities to the complete neglect of our local, provincial, and federal levels of government.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Ellie. I'm going to pass it over to Latisha.
Yeah, I mean, it would be hard to go after Ellie because I think she pretty much summed it up. I was reflecting yesterday on, because it's been almost a year for FoodShare to be running the emergency good food box, which, you know, has provided about 80,000 free boxes to community members. And ultimately, FoodShare has never been in operating a model where we distribute free food. That was never our intent, nor our mission. Really, for us, we've always been about advocating for creating the condition in which, you know, people are able to access the food that they need and want in dignity. And I guess a year ago when everything happened, Black Creek Community Farm really is that the reason why we started all of this. They came to us and they were like, hey, you know what? We have some money. We're going to buy boxes for community members in the Jen and Fitch area who are, you know, just really impacted by what is happening with COVID. And that was really at the beginning. And we're like, okay, you know what? We have the setup, we have the system, we run the social enterprise good food box. Let's do this. And then that was, you know, first week, mid-March. And looking back, 4 weeks in, we had so many groups coming to us and being like, hey, you know what, everything's shutting down, you know, there's no more good food market, like no more access for folks who were already struggling before COVID, and now it was getting worse. And so I guess, you know, we just stepped in and fundraise for and distribute the money among, you know, 80 different groups. And I think for me, reflecting back of like, yeah, how, you know, we used to distribute 250 boxes a week, and, you know, we had our little social enterprise and trying to grow that. And then all of a sudden the pandemic happened and we were doing about 2,500 emergency boxes a week alone, and having to, you know, navigate all of that and trying to do really our best to support the communities that we've been working with. And I think that has been FoodShare approach, is what I would say is we stepping into that role, not because we wanted to, but really because we listened from what was happening on the ground, and we listened to, you know, the group we've been working alongside, and that was the need. And as Ellie mentioned, like ultimately, this is not the role of FoodShare or any charity or any group really to solve food insecurity, but something needed to be done, and that's what happened. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I'm going to pass it over to Moorthi.
For me, one thing that I took that shined light is when we said food insecurity, some people didn't really understand what food insecurity means. So by having this pandemic really exposed the reality for some people that who are experiencing daily, otherwise they would never experience. So most of the community didn't experience it daily, but some people in our community was experiencing food insecurity daily. When I said food insecurity, having like employment, housing, so combination of those things, those people were experiencing before the pandemic. but this exposed the mass, everybody, to the reality what is food insecurity means. And one other thing that it also exposes, like organizations like FoodShare, what have been telling the policymakers, the government, like take a leadership on food insecurity, and constant ignoring that call for action is being exposed during this pandemic. So I think that's one big key thing. And the other thing that it amazed me was during the pandemic in the middle, like when we were looking at the funds that came to support the emergency boxes, came from individual people, not from bigger organizations, not from bigger corporations. So it showed me that how much our community cares for each other, even during a pandemic. Mm-hmm. So it blows my mind, and it made me, very positive to work, to get more things done, and knowing that our community is together during this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, Moorthi. Thank you for touching on that note, the kind of the theme of care, and how so many individuals, so many of us have kind of stepped in to fill in that gap where governments have kind of left open. And this is where I want to throw it over to Ellie for a moment. As a frontline service provider, somebody who works at Maggie's, the People's Pantry, what have you been hearing directly from the individuals that you work with about some of the food insecurity issues that they're facing? Because so many of, kind of the rhetoric that we hear, and particularly as myself who works in policy, or even those who work in government, is very far removed from sometimes the very real experiences that people are having. So I'd love for you to take a couple minutes to just kind of outline what exactly have you been hearing that you feel that we all need to know directly from the front lines.
I mean, I think the biggest takeaway is that people are suffering, and it's bad, and it's been bad for a long time. And I mean, I think that the pandemic has really just sort of exacerbated existing issues of like poverty, homelessness, and already people sort of struggling to access food. But I do think one thing that's very interesting is that, a lot of our communities have very deep, personal, intimate experiences with things like poverty, food injustice, food insecurity. And I feel as though some of the organizing that's come in response to some of that, and specifically around the pandemic, although this has been happening for a while, I think that in organizing some of these responses, we've been able to sort of give people the language to name those experiences, right? And I think, it's so difficult for people to be talking very openly about struggling to make rent, about struggling to afford housing, about struggling to afford food, because I think we live in a culture, particularly in this city, that very much sort of blames the individual. Well, if you don't have this, it's because you're not working hard enough. It's because there's something that's wrong with you. Maybe you should just go get a job. But, one of the things that we've sort of seen through the pandemic is this sort of, I think that, this sort of suffering, but at the same time, this sort of collective empowerment, right? And I think about that across a number of different scales. If you think about the tenants organizing in Parkdale for rent, not just rent moratoriums, but challenging the fact that why do we still have to pay rent through a pandemic when people are being laid off and losing our jobs, and how that motto sort of spreading to other apartment buildings, housing blocks across Toronto and the GTA, or thinking about the overdose prevention site workers in Moss Park, right, who were challenging the city, fighting the city to be able to stay and remain in that space to provide safe drug use supplies and oversight to people so that their communities wouldn't die, right? Similar things with the encampment support network. So I think that a lot of what people are seeing and experiencing on the ground. I mean, one, it's been very well documented and publicized because a lot of people are actively tweeting about it, but it's we're watching our friends die, right? We're watching our friends and our family and our communities be left out in the cold. We're watching the city come and take away tiny shelters that are keeping people warm through freezing winters, right? We're watching sex workers get left behind in pandemic relief strategies because of very misogynistic, gendered sort of violence towards a particular community, right? Groups that are criminalized or just targeted by police violence, particularly Black and Indigenous populations in the city, and it very specifically in the downtown East End as well, are just being completely left behind by the city. And I think that some of the organizing that we're seeing and celebrating is one in direct response to that. And as beautiful as that is, I think for a lot of people, it's also deeply traumatic. It's a deeply traumatic experience to think, I need to show up in this space that my people don't die, and I think we sort of have to balance our, There's sort of this public narrative when a campaign gets popular to celebrate and be like, oh, this is really beautiful. And it is, right? It's beautiful, it's courageous, like our people are strong and our people are resilient. But, you know, one, it did not need to be this way. And it should not have to be everyday people showing up so that other people don't die, so we don't lose our friends and family. But also I think like the one thing that maybe isn't getting as much coverage as it should be is just like the loss and the pain and the trauma of seeing so many of our people die in really awful and degrading ways.
I want to pause right there for just a moment, because I think it's really important for us to dive deeply into a policy discussion that I feel like you're going to have a lot of insights on in terms of what are some of the policy shifts that we need to see. So I want to pause there because that's a really powerful note to end on. And I want to go to Latisha and talk more in-depthly about the charity model. So Ellie had pointed to the fact that so many people have stepped in this moment in time, where step in to fill in the gaps that governments have not been providing, where governments have actively left out vulnerable groups. And what FoodShare has been doing over this past year has been providing, as you mentioned, free good food boxes, something that you never really imagined would be a need. So I do want to ask you, what do you feel about this charity model of directly providing folks with the goods that they need immediately? But how can we actually take that one step further and supplement that? What is needed in addition to the charity model, but also why is the charity model, why has it been so effective during this time?
Yeah, that's a lot of questions in one question.
Yes, it was loaded. Answer how you see fit.
Yeah, so I mean, the short answer in what's needed, and I think Ellie has, and even Moorthi have touched on that, is that the government, the different level of government needs to step in and really address the root cause that are causing food insecurity and social inequities, you know, which are, you know, things like racism and transphobia, patriarchy, how all of that expressed in our, you know, institution. And that really is holding people who are, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color even more vulnerable to facing food insecurity than a white person would be. So I think that's really what needs to happen. Regarding the charity model, obviously I work in a charity. My hope is one day, you know, we're not needed. This is not what, you know, that we have a system that works so people are able to have housing, like affordable housing, that they're able to buy their food, that they, you know, like do all those things without relying on, you know, the goodwill of people who provide support to charity, who then provide people like support to people. Ultimately, you know, I think this is something at FoodShare we've been pretty vocal about, is that, you know, food intervention, food bank, all of that, it's a temporary, like it was meant to be a temporary measure. And I think 30 years or 40 years later, we're still in the same situation. And sure, right now and during the pandemic, you know, this was needed, but it's a band-aid solution. It's not going to solve food insecurity. It is not to resolve the issue of income inequalities. It's not going to change any of that unless the government really steps in. And I think, yeah, and I guess I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I'm going to go over to Moorthi to kind of get his expertise in this particular area. So Moorthi, you mentioned or part of your bio, I know part of your work is delivering food boxes and the delivery service that you provide. Can we talk about what has it been like to work during this moment and deliver a service to people that are in such extreme need? What has the culture been like? How has it been able to transport goods and services to individuals? And what exactly have you been hearing from the folks that you've been interacting with?
So first of all, I'll shout out to my team because they have been doing this day and night most of the time. And like, it's a really amazing group of people. And when you talk about teams, again, this goes back to the organization. Like what FoodShare decided was to provide a bonus pay for every hour they work, with another $4 increase to their hourly wage, which is provided a moral support to the team and for the folks who are working to know that, appreciating that during this time, the organization appreciate their coming in. So I think that was a huge thing for the team to know that the organization acknowledge the work they do. And again, we are a small organization, right, with a very limited resources. So with the huge demand, it was challenging for us to, because there was, again, this goes back to the government again. I need to be very clear about that, because they did not provide us any support. I could say that.
But when you say the government, which level of government are you referring to in general? Or does it not matter?
Does not matter. It will start from the city, province, federal. Like, they did not provide enough support to us. They did not provide that. I want to be very clear, because they had a huge responsibility to provide support.
Yeah.
So that's, without that support, it was challenging for us to overcome the challenges we had. But we, as a team, and with the support of the community, we found different solutions. We created different mechanisms to work out the day-to-day challenges that we had.
Yeah, thank you for kind of spelling that out so clearly, how it doesn't matter which level of government stepped in. What matters is that somebody needed to, right? And so often during, moments of crises, but in general, in normal time or regular times or the before times, we get so caught up on jurisdictional correctness, who's supposed to be responsible for what. And as people are fighting, or different levels of government are fighting or trying to pass the buck, there are actual real people, as Ellie has spelled out, who are struggling and who are dying and who are being left behind. So it's always important to put that into context, that when people are in need, it doesn't matter who. Somebody just needs to step up, and somebody needs to do their job and provide the supports and services that are needed. So thank you for that, Moorthi. So I want to go over to Ellie and really unpack some of kind of the deep systemic issues that we're seeing. You made an excellent point by stating that the one thing that has kind of been good about this time is that people are being really out in the open about some of the systemic issues that have been plaguing society for quite some time. So talking about their inability to pay rent and not having it feel as if it's an individual fault or their personal responsibility, but that it's a failing of the system that we're in, and talking about people's inability to meet ends meet. So I want to hear from you. What are some of the concrete policy changes do you feel and see that need to happen that have not occurred? We know that we saw the introduction of CERB, which is now the CRB. So there has been some sort of financial supports. Do you feel those financial supports were adequate? There has been some tweaks to OW and ODSP in Ontario and some provincial programs across the country, but again, nothing really substantial. So I want to hear from you. What are some of the policy changes that need to be done immediately to have maybe avoided some of the deep food insecurity issues that we're seeing right now?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. And I think that, one of the things I keep coming back to, like organizations like the People's Pantry, we're not a charity, and we're very deliberately not a charity because we sort of put this idea of solidarity over charity and sort of shift away from the nonprofit model. But one of the things that I think comes up a lot, both in People's Pantry and in Maggie's, is that, we're not just dealing with an issue of neglect from the city or neglect from the province or neglect from the federal government and people being left out of CRB. We're dealing with like very deliberate decisions being made. And so, let's think about like COVID, the pandemic response, and CERB, for example. A lot of sex workers, one, aren't eligible for that. Two, if they choose to apply for it and are outed as sex workers, they could lose their housing, they could lose their kids, they could lose other jobs. It has implications already, just don't even have access being put out from, any level of government, really. And I also think that like when we're talking about like, it's very difficult to get to the place of like, what are some of the concrete policy solutions? Because, I come from a belief in like politics that like, no level of government is actually set up to support my community. It's not really set up to support poor and working class people or sex workers or people living on the streets. And so, look in the city of Toronto, how many empty condos do we have right now, right down by the waterfront? Why is it that there are hundreds, thousands of people living outside in encampments when there are empty units sitting right there, right? That's not an issue of neglect. That's a deliberate policy decision to leave thousands of people out in the cold and to send in unionized city workers to come in and tear those shelters down, right? When bylaw enforcement officers and Toronto police entrap and arrest sex workers in the city through this pandemic, that's a deliberate decision to arrest and throw these people in jail as opposed to recognizing their rights as workers, right? And so it's very difficult to even get to a place of like, what concrete policies need to change, when really we're still in a place of like, we need you to stop killing us. Like, we need Toronto police to stop killing Black people. We need bylaw enforcement officers to stop harassing and threatening sex workers, right? We need city workers and John Tory to drop the legal action against Khalil in the Tiny Shelter Project and to stop taking away those places of shelter and to give people housing. And I think that we're in a place right now where it's like, we're not seeing these things happening because no level of government, John Tory, Doug Ford, Justin Trudeau, they don't want to give these sort of relief efforts out to people. And that's why people have had to step in. And so it's not just an issue of neglect, that help is not coming. And that's why mutual aid has been so important through this time.
Wow. Ooh, I can listen to you talk all day, Ellie. But yes, you have touched on so much, and it's the fact that before we can get to the solutions, what I'm hearing from you, before we can even start thinking about solutions, we have to talk about the fact that people's livelihoods, people's lives are being threatened. And you can't even jump to a solution before you stop killing and threatening people's actual lives. So that, I think that's really powerful, because I would even say in, you know, folks who work in government, folks who work in policy, folks who are trying to craft these solutions, they're not even thinking about the fact that they're jumping a whole bunch of steps before you can actually address the problem. So thank you for laying that out so brilliantly. Thank you. So I'm going to go over to Latisha, and I'm just going to ask you to supplement the conversation. How do you feel about, you know, the policy landscape that currently exists as it relates to some of the different levers or measures that governments have implemented throughout this pandemic? Do you feel it's sufficient? Do you feel it's inadequate? What would you have liked to see? Just kind of riff off what Ellie kind of outlined for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to go after Ellie because I find like she really summed it up in you know, in the perfect way, and I echo everything that Ellie has said. I mean, you know, I don't think the response was enough. I'm not a policy, you know, wizard by any means, but I think that we've seen it even within FoodShare, like folks that were left out from, you know, the response from the government to support when COVID hit. So one example is we, because of COVID, one of those organizations who actually had to hire a lot of folks, because, you know, we went from doing really a small operation to something that was way more than what we ever imagined doing at some point. And initially, a group of folks that we ended up working a lot with was international students. You know, they were stuck here, couldn't go home, lost their job. Like a lot of them have a visa that allowed them to work 20 hours a week. All of them lost their job, and then there was nothing for them. There was, you know, no program kind of supporting them. And so when we started hiring folks, like Moorthi can probably speak a bit more about that, but a lot of folks that we hire were actually international students. If we talk about migrant workers, who are people who really put our food on the table, whether people want to admit that, know that, or kind of just ignore the issue altogether. A lot of them, you know, have no access. Like even before the pandemic, that was already an issue in how, you know, their treatment, and the fact that, you know, they are working here, they don't get paid minimum wage, they don't get access to the same healthcare service. Like, you know, if they get sick, they get sent home, and that's like, that was already totally unacceptable. And I think the COVID crisis has kind of like put a light on what is actually happening in Canada, you know, in Ontario. And again, there are folks who didn't get anything. Like they are working here. And you know, they have access to nothing. They you know, when there's an outbreak, because they're living in like poor condition, all cramped into a small room, just sharing, you know, everything. And then everybody gets sick, and there's been many cases of like folks dying, and nothing has been done for those folks. And still a year in, like when you look at like all the programs that exist that are, I find personally highly confusing to navigate what you should apply, not apply, what you're eligible for, not eligible for. Like, you know, I think that thing also needs to be streamlined in a really easy system. And even, you know, folks who were receiving Ontario disability support, like, you know, they receive less than what you were getting. Like it also shows inequality in how the system before was working. So yeah,
Are you sure you're not a policy whiz, Ellie? Because what you just shared with us was like the deep intricacies of how flawed the system is. So I think you know a lot more than you lead on to. But yeah, no, absolutely. I think you touched on something that was really critical, and it's the aspect of the hidden worker, right? Migrant workers, international students, those who work under the table, those who work for cash, gig economy workers, live-in caregivers, the workers that you don't see out front in your face, and the workers who are most vulnerable as it relates to employer intimidation, exploitation, underpay, a lack of decent work conditions. And they have absolutely been the ones that have completely been missed in our pandemic response. And if they were even thought of, it was too late. You know, migrant workers have been facing the brunt of COVID, experiencing or contracting COVID. And by the time news reports are coming out, you know, after one after the other, I mean, we didn't get a pandemic response until like 6-7 months in from the feds, and that it wasn't even anywhere remotely that effective that it needed to be. So yeah, the aspect of the hidden worker and even those who don't work and who are excluded from the labor market for a number of different reasons has been a huge sore spot. So I'm going to go over to Moorthi, and I'm going to also ask you to just add on or supplement this conversation here as well. And if you can even bring in the conversation around how poverty is a core driver of food insecurity. And it's something that we're seeing even more so during this pandemic as well.
So yes, so one thing I want to also add to highlight is we also had some partnership with northern communities before the pandemic that we did. And the reality for those communities, they were experiencing food insecurity, what we experienced during the pandemic throughout the year over there. So they were kind of isolated from the rest of the population, and they were experiencing what we are experiencing during this pandemic, during every single day before that. And going back to income, I think it is the key, because as most of us experienced, even my family members experienced, like when you lose your income, it has a ripple effect. One major thing that it has is in your mental health, because then you start worrying what's going to be your next step. And this is what our community members, some of our community members were experiencing day to day. And then when you couldn't get your income in, and then when you are in, when you couldn't get your rent payments in, then it added extra stress for you, for the person, and just for the family. To when you don't have a proper housing, how you could sustain yourself, and how we could move forward throughout this time. This is where they need the support. This is where the government has to be intervened, and they were refusing. They didn't do it at all. So one key thing that I see is the income is a huge component. This is where we need to talk about basic income, how that could have prevented, or how could have supported our communities during a time like this, which organizations like FoodShare has been talking about, but unfortunately none of the government didn't provide the leadership they should have provided, and they're still refusing to do so. And also I want to remind everybody, earlier I talked about my team, so we have a small video that behind the scenes that my team was doing. So when you get a chance, have a look at the video. And also, again, talking about the forgotten worker, FoodShare did an exhibition called In the Pit. If you guys had a chance to have a look at it, it also highlighted some of the workers that been forgotten, like especially like dishwashers in our restaurants, that how their work is being forgotten in a way. So.
Thank you so much. As we're kind of closing out the event, we're in the last 15 minutes here, folks. So if there are any questions that people want to ask, if there are any comments, please feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A function, and we'll make sure to get that as we begin to wrap things up. So I want to actually throw this question over to, I'm going to start with Latisha and then work my way to Ellie and then Moorthi. I want to have a conversation about funding. How funding could or could not, and this is also government funding, or this can be private funding, or this could even be, government or private, how funding could or could not improve the operations of food insecurity work. Latisha, you work at FoodShare, so you can kind of tailor this question to your work there. But what is the relationship between funding and good operations and providing people the service that they need or the supports that they need?
Yeah, that's an excellent question that we've had lots of conversation since I joined FoodShare. I guess I would say, to operate, whether you're a small organization, a larger organization, like there's many things that goes into operating program like the emergency good food box or any food intervention, and we do rely, often on external funding to do that. One of our approach at FoodShare has been that we're looking at our social enterprises. So we run the Good Food Box usually as a social enterprise. We have an online store where, individual can buy the box and much more. And for us, we are trying to shift. For the past 3 years, we've actually working at trying to shift that model that was set up as a program, like really in the charity sense, nonprofit sense, into a social enterprise, so we can have access to unrestricted funds. Because what often happens when you get funding, especially when you get funded for grants and stuff, it's like tied to really specific thing, which sometimes doesn't even match what the community actually needs. Mm-hmm. So I guess if I had, one thing to say, because I do not know who is in the audience, but if you are a funder, or even if you are an individual donor, someone who has financial means to give to organization, like keep in mind that we do have to pay for the toilet paper. We do have to pay for the office space. We do have to pay for the admin work that goes beyond everything. Not everything, can just go to the produce itself. So just, be mindful of that, because I've seen many scenarios, where you have a gap. There's something, so ever you supply that with volunteer work, which I know at FoodShare, when I started, the Good Food Box was heavily relying on volunteers. Lots of them were actually folks who were facing food insecurity. And I'll be quite honest in this conversation, because I think it's important for people to know that we used to, in exchange of a few hours of work, give a Good Food Box. And I remember when I joined in, and Moorthi and I had a lot of conversation, we're like, we can't do that. Like either we pay people because we have a need for work, or we find another way, but we can't use, folks that are facing food insecurity as a means to distribute boxes to people who should be really paying for them. And so sorry, that kind of a weird end.
Thank you. Yeah. You touched on a lot there. I'm going to go over to Ellie. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was great. I found it really helpful. And it really reminds me of how important having dignified working conditions are, and that organizations committed to any kind of social justice or human rights work need to be able to ensure that the people who are being employed by the organization to do the work are being paid, not just a fair wage, a living wage, right? And we're not just sort of getting the most work out of people for as little income as possible. There has to, our organizations and our internal structures have to operate with the same kind of integrity as our public facing efforts. And so, when I think about the question of funding, for People's Pantry, we've been lucky enough to get some emergency COVID grants. And also we really benefit from individual donors. That's been really important for funding our work. For Maggie's recently though, because so many sex workers either were directly ineligible to apply for CERB or had a lot on the line in terms of child custody and housing if being outed as a sex worker, we did our own fundraising for that. And we relied purely on individual donors to help us raise our collectively now around $250,000 to give out small grants to people on our own. But in terms of government funding, Maggie's does receive funding from the Public Health Agency of Canada, Toronto Urban Health Fund. So from different levels of the city, the province, and the federal government. And I think one thing that's very challenging for us is it's very difficult because as Ontario sort of shifts into a more conservative leadership and politics, one thing that I think a lot of our social justice organizations are worried about is is our funding now tied to the political leanings and beliefs of leaders like Doug Ford, right? And if that's the case, if we're getting more increasingly conservative, these are the people green lighting police sting operations against sex workers, telling
I think Ellie is frozen a bit. Okay, so I'm going to go over to Moorthi until Ellie comes back, and I'd like to get you in on the conversation, Moorthi, as how you feel about the conversation around funding and sustaining operations, food insecurity operations, particularly during this time.
So again, sometimes what I have noticed is sometimes when funding comes in, it comes with certain strings attached. So when a situation like the pandemic happens, organizations who relied on the funds cannot even use that fund to something else because that flexibility wasn't sometimes there to cover the other much needed immediate response that we needed. So that's also another challenge I see with the funding. And also sometimes what I see is with the funding is what does that like where did that funds come from, right? And then what is that funds is doing? Like, you know, as Latisha said, like we cannot use the 100% of that just for fruits and vegetables. It needs sometimes there's a gap in the funding structure. I think like they have ignored who is doing the work, how the other part, like I think this is a good time for us to, like, even if there's any funders, I would like to request it to see how you how do you support your funding? Like, you know, can you allocate a certain percentage, at least 20% of that funding for admin operations that in order to drive that project, right? So I think this is a good time for us to because good time to see lots of things in different ways and to analyze it, like, you know, like to find permanent solution from bandage solution, right? Mm-hmm. So some of the other challenge I also see, not just with funding, is the policies that we have, our bandage policies we have. That's why we are talking about this towards now. We shouldn't be talking about this now, but we could have addressed this long time ago if we were not on that bandage policy that was created a long time ago, right?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for laying that out for us. As we, you know, come to a close, I'm thinking about how important our organizations work to address food insecurity, how important it is in general, but how significant it has been during this particular time. And to hear that, you know, the good food boxes have been scaled up and FoodShare has been able to provide or fill in that gap it's really remarkable. The unfortunate aspect of that is that food needs are in such high demand, right? And, you know, for folks who don't experience food insecurity, it can be hard to wrap your mind around, you know, how much food bank lines have increased over the last few months, how much people are really trying to decide between paying their rent or putting food on the table, and how that does, as you mentioned, Moorthi, impacts mental health, impacts, you know, ability to work, ability to provide, ability to have good relationships, ability to show up in our world. And those are all things we need to put into context. So as we close out the event, I want to ask you all to quickly, 1 minute, to talk about what are some of the values that you hold as it relates to addressing food insecurity work. What are some of the things that you keep near to you as you approach your work and that you remind yourself of that keeps you going day by day? Latisha.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. For me, I find, you know, my I don't know if it's my value, but I find my strength in working, you know, with folks like Moorthi, the whole social enterprise team, and seeing everything that has been done. And it's been inspiring to see what's happening and how much people are, you know, just keep going, because there's no choice right now than just keep going. But just, I guess, to close, if I just, the one thing I would want folks to kind of take away maybe from this conversation, a few things. One, if you are a white person like me, do the work, like understand what are the form of oppression that are, you know, holding the inequalities in our system, and really like get involved and make things happen. It is not the work of, you know, Black, Indigenous, and people of color to educate people that look like me. And people really have to start, you know, doing the work. If you have the financial means, like, support organizations that are on the ground doing the work, because right now there's nothing else happening. And then the last piece I would say, and I think that ties into the webinar that is, or the panel that is happening tomorrow from 2:30 to 4:30, like, hold your elected official accountable. Like, if we think about what happened yesterday with pharmacare, it's outrageous. Like, email, call, use the panel that is happening tomorrow to, like, have your say and raise your voice, because this is how things are going to change. And organize, like, look at what's happening in your community. A lot is happening right now. Just join what is already happening and just elevate the voice of that. And yeah, that would be my final words.
Thank you. I'm going to go over to Ellie. Ellie, did you hear kind of the closing question? Awesome. So I'm going to pass it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, a lot of my work in activism comes down to like my lived experience and trying to be in community and show up for my community. And like, listen, I think, thinking about being younger and like being on the receiving end of food boxes, when I was a kid, maybe I didn't have the language of food insecurity, but I knew I was poor, right? Or like getting evicted. I knew that it was wrong. I knew that it was dangerous. I didn't have the language to sort of like root that in like a political landscape or framework. And to me, mutual aid work and solidarity work is so important, because it's important for us to show up for one another, but also to show people that, like, one, it does not need to be like this. And two, we can put the work in to make the world a better place and to know that a better world is possible. And, as much as I think the pandemic has also shown us that, like, so many people in our community who thought that they were so far from being poor or being working class are simply one paycheck away from having their housing threatened, from not being able to make rent, not being able to afford groceries. And I think to that end, we really need to challenge the idea that, like, we need to be competing with each other, right? You are not a failure if you can't make rent. You're not a failure if you can't afford food. What you are is in solidarity with an entire class of people experiencing the same thing. And if we're all experiencing it, it means that we can sort of push back and challenge it. And maybe just the very last thing that I will say is sort of like the sort of mantra that I tell myself over and over again for People's Pantry and for Maggie's is, like, as much as this is about, food or housing or shelter, this is also about life. And so committing to struggles for racial justice, human rights, that is about fighting for life and dignity and freedom. And I think about a quote from Latisha Sartevra. She says, "It's our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love and support one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains." So I just implore you all to get involved in mutual aid work. And thank you to FoodShare for hosting this really great discussion.
Thank you so much. I'm actually going to end it there. And that is a very, very powerful quote for us to all reflect on. Thank you so much for everybody for coming. I hope you got as much out of the conversation that I did. I have the honor and pleasure of hosting, but also listening to these really brilliant folks who are doing some really important work during this time. So I'm going to pass it over to Mo. Thank you again. And let's keep supporting this organization.